Hey Mark, how you doing?
Hey Jeff, how are you? I love the background.
There you go. There you go. We honor our guests and our great design minds. With us today, Mr. Mark Bates, the creative mind behind a very big concept in a fairly small box. It's not much bigger than the 12-page rule book here. It's called World Cup, as you can see. I'll just read the blurb on the back here. Why wait for the World Cup? The goal of World Cup is to draft a group of countries, an association, and lead one of them to the world's greatest prize. Use the cards in your hand to attack, score goals, and defend against the opposition. Since you control multiple teams, you must make difficult choices to determine which of your sides will win the World Cup. You've got all these action cards, very card driven. You can score goals, you can defend, and you're running a group of four teams, right? And it's
It depends on this. Depends on the number of players in your game. I mean, I've played with as many as 8 or 9 players. So you might even have 4 or 3 teams in your association. When you have 2 or 3 players, someone had said one time, well, you could have 2 players and have 16 teams each, but I kind of capped it at 6 teams. So you pick 6 teams. Maybe they're all strong teams, and I had a few people in the play testing that said, hey, it's pretty easy to get through the group stage and into the knockout rounds, but man, if you've got Argentina and your opponent's got France, you know that's going to, as we know in real life, we know that's going to be a heavyweight matchup to see who's going to win the World Cup.
so tell me kind of your gaming tendencies, your good old gaming history story. What led you to soccer? Are you just a huge soccer fan?
As I was telling someone, I'm a fan of all sports. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Maybe hopefully I don't look that old, but that's when I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I remember following the World Cup. It was kind of my first experience where, of course, I love baseball and basketball where you have teams playing against other teams, but the World Cup was really my first exposure of countries playing against other countries. And so I remember back in the day where the World Cup would be, of course, in America, would be in American newspapers. Usually the results would be a day or two later after they were actually played, let alone no TV coverage, no other way to follow the tournament. So I played a lot of soccer growing up. I grew up in the Bay Area, what's now Silicon Valley in California. So kind of back then, and still is a kind of a hotbed of soccer. The San Jose Earthquakes were a North American Soccer League team there, and now they have their MLS team there as well. And so really love soccer and just love the kind of the purity of that and the simplicity of that game. And so when it came to developing a sports-based game, I just couldn't think of anything better. Although there's a lot of stories behind this particular iteration of the game, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
And you've got, of course, you've got the expansions, the laws of the game. You've got Euro 2020, Qatar 22. The set also that I have, of course, has a World Cup 2018, good old Germany and England and Sweden. Then you got France 2019. You got Scotland, Netherlands, good old US. The logo on the back here. I trust France has the different card because they were the host.
Yes, they were the host. That's correct.
And
That's correct.
US, another US card. So you actually have 2 cards here. And this one is double-sided. So it's all card-driven action. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, because one of the big themes that I like to drive home is, you get all these Euro game players, you got all these tabletop, stats sports games, but the two kind of seem not to quite meet. But this game, would you say, is it kind of Euro adjacent at least?
I think it's Euro adjacent. This came from, and I say this in the on my website, and I talk about this in the game. This is an iteration of an idea brought on by Shaun Derrick, who created the World Cup game. And I came across that game. I knew I had gone to some game conventions where people played it. Being a fan of World Cup soccer, it was like, hey, you can play the whole World Cup tournament in one sitting. I really love that idea. That game, though, had, I think, 2 separate game boards. It had a deck of custom dice. It had plastic soccer balls, and it had pressed cardboard tokens for the countries. And it's just a lot of different pieces. A great game, a beautiful game. I got my own copy on eBay for $20, and I've had people offer me hundreds of dollars for it. It's that rare and so in demand. When I wanted to remake the concept, and I asked Shaun Derrick for his permission in doing this, I wanted to make it as a card-based, a card-only game. So there weren't other elements in there. I think a little bit more compact. And I actually think we brought some pretty fun elements into it. But going to your question, I mean, it is, I grew up, now I know you're APBA, I grew up playing a lot of Avalon Hill games. So Status Pro Baseball, Speed Circuit, Pay Dirt, so many. I mean, I probably have still 20 of them, 20 of the Status Pro games. I had a lot of other friends that played APBA, some people that played Stratomatic, of course. So a lot of different of those, and like you were mentioning, those often required, hey, you'd roll a die or draw a card and then look on a sheet of paper to see what the result is. And those are nice for accuracy. You could almost just replay a series, but I wanted this to be a little bit more interactive. I've had some friends who are Canadian that say, hey, even though Canada isn't a strong team in this last World Cup, I'm going to draw them and see how far I can get them along the road. And that's been kind of a fun aspect of this game as well.
If you look at the cards, just look at the team cards, Sweden 2018 here. Anticipation. Once this turn, when any card is played, may immediately show card from hand. You talk about kind of the history of the team's performance in that tournament. And I just wonder how much of this is kind of statistics based and how much is kind of licensed that kind of goes with the general feel, say Italy is a score and clamp down versus the speedy Brazilians kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In Shaun's original game, every team has a power and a skill level. So the power is the number of cards they can play on their team during the course of a match day. So that's usually 2, 3, or 4. I have a few cards in there that are 5 power cards. Skill level is a color system. I kind of took Shaun's system based on kind of the martial arts. Black and then is the highest, and then red all the way down to like gray or white. And that's the ability. Now, Shaun had a great mechanic, which of course I stole for this game, which is having extra events happen during stoppage time. So after the game, after you draw, now in my game, after you draw the final whistle card, then you have some cards that are hidden that you reveal that determine which teams score extra half goals, which sound funny, in stoppage time. And that makes a big difference in the game as well. What I did in World Cup is I kept that exact same mechanic. So every team has a number rating, which is their power, and then a color rating, which is their skill. I also added a unique team ability to each team. Now, I've had a lot of people that have just literally played with the basic rules, which basically kind of matches what would have happened in Shaun's game. But I've had a few people that when we play test with the advanced rules. And then you can kind of get a little bit more into some nuances of each team. Some teams really do specialize in defense, and you can have cards that enhance that more. I have a few just fun little, I wouldn't call them Easter eggs, but fun little shout outs there. Uruguay, I think in one of the games, one of the World Cups, 18 or 22, Uruguay has a card called Bite as their special ability, which is a little bit of a shout out to maybe some Uruguayan striker who likes taking little chomps out of people here and there. So that's been a really fun aspect to just kind of add a little bit more detail to the game. And those reference cards that you held up there, I wanted the game to be as educational as it was entertaining. So even if you didn't know about how Sweden has done in previous World Cups, you can read that on the reference card when you're looking at that, maybe in between plays when it's not your turn and so on like that.
Speaking of those cards, they're super well designed. Mr. Andy Bates did the art, correct?
Yeah, my brother did all the art for all the event cards and for those card backs that you showed. My brother's a brilliant designer. He kind of works in the tech industry in his day job. He did the art for the box. It's been fun to work with him and really fun to see the different kinds of images. The other thing about the game is that with the 2019 Women's World Cup in there, we've tried to make it kind of gender equal. Right now with the Euro and with the latest Men's World Cup, we have more men's sets that are out there. But my goal is over time is to have expansions where we feature not only all the men's, but all the women's World Cups. And I think that's, hey, for Americans, man, that's the best way to win the World Cup is to follow the women's team. But also really great as we have as the audience of soccer fans has really grown across the gender divide, I would say.
Performance wise, we talk a lot about normalization. Often we play, era to era to era, which maybe not be optimal. And it's really kind of a art as much of a science. But I wonder if, and speaking of expansions, if you've thought about creating more historic teams, and if you can really take a cellar dweller kind of a team, bottom of the group, to the cup, is there kind of that equal ability? Instead of say Germany winning,
Yeah. Yeah, that's really part of the beauty of the game. So if I have a Germany and I have a Mexico and I have a Brazil and then I have a team like Canada. You know, Canada, of course, was one of the, I can keep saying, one of the lower rated teams in this last World Cup. Then when it, because the card play is when it's your turn, you have the choice if you're going to play to influence which of your teams are playing. Now, not all your teams might be playing at the same time, but man, if I'm looking at a Brazil, which is a very strong favorite versus a Canada, I have to make that decision. And that's the strategic part of the game. And so it's interesting because in play testing, there's also the question about if you want the game to be accurate more than entertaining or entertaining more than accurate. If you just put 32 countries in a tournament and then you make them all the same, then who knows? Maybe South Africa could win the World Cup, or Ecuador, or Lithuania. But if you make it too accurate, then you don't really allow the opportunity for a smaller country. And we saw in the what I would call the real World Cup, we saw Morocco make a historic run for an African country. And I would hope that you could simulate that in the game, because Morocco is maybe not one of the top 4 teams in the world, but they certainly played like it in that tournament. And that's the beauty of such a short design tournament like this.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I've heard, if you talk about, say, APBA baseball or APBA generally, that the pennant winner was kind of given that little extra boost just to kind of, I guess, keep the bulk of fans happy and kind of keep performance, kind of on par with reality. But with all your kind of card-driven action and kind of, your the way you have to make decisions, and you have a link to your playthrough video where you show 4 players and you've got 4 games kind of going on and people are attacking, defending down the line of different teams. So you're kind of running 4 teams at the same time. But I just wonder how much you're able to influence and kind of maybe build momentum or lose momentum, or if that's not really much of a mechanic.
Well, yeah, no, that's a huge part of the game. The other part of the game, and I don't know if this is technically Euro game style, but I think it has that feel, is hand management. So you start at the beginning of the tournament with 3 cards in your hand, and then as it goes into the group stage, you get 4 cards in your hand, and in the final couple of rounds, you get 5 cards. And one of the key elements of the game is that you keep the cards in your hand from match day to match day. So I've had people say, hey, if I get a 2-goal card in my hand, why wouldn't I just play that right away on one of my teams? Well, if you've got Germany and Germany's already up 3-1 in the game that you're playing in, you could add that 2-goal card to make it 5-1, but that might be a waste of a card play if you save it for the next match day when one of your lower rated teams could really use it. Now, of course, the moment you do that, maybe your opponent has a 2-goal card and they tie it up 3-3, and all of a sudden the game ends in a tie, or if it goes to overtime or penalty kicks, that happens as well. I've seen the players that really understand that early on do super well in the later rounds of the tournament, where you want to eventually win the World Cup.
As you refine this into the final product, can you speak to some of the elements that maybe you thought would work but kind of fell by the wayside in testing, or some of the things that lasted all the way from beginning to end?
Shaun's original game, and this isn't a knock on Shaun's game at all, he had a few cards in there where if you played it on a higher level team, it would be worth 3 goals. But if you played it on a lower level team, it would be worth 2 or 1 goal. And that, I think, was his design in order to, and that was very easy to do in his system. And so that was his design to try to go back to this accuracy model, right? So I've got this strong card in my hand. It would make sense for me to play it on Brazil, where they might score 3 goals in a matter of time, but less likely to play it on a team like Costa Rica that probably wouldn't be able to manage that, right? And so I tried that in some of the early iterations of my event cards, and it was just too confusing for players to have a card that did different things with different teams. So I kind of took that out of it there. We were able to, we kind of fooled around a lot with the corner kick card. That's an element that isn't in the original, Shaun's original game, but and I added a few cards like an assist card. I have a few other cards that as we go through future expansions that we're going to add to the event deck. So if you buy the think if you buy right now, if you buy the Laws of the Game expansion, I believe that one comes with the throw-in card, which then protects the last event on a card row. I mean, the other great thing about the game we haven't really talked about a lot is I can play a goal on my team, but on the next way around, you see this in the playthrough video, someone could play an offsides card on it, and all of a sudden that's gone. We had a lot of fun play testing a lot of the Laws of the Game cards. So things like VAR, things like yellow cards, red cards. Those, I mean, in a group setting, that has a great feel to kind of see that happen. I haven't heard a lot of our Kickstarter customers yet really talk about playing with those, but I think it's been a fun element of the game that I hope to enhance and develop as we go further as well.
Speaking of your audience, what was your target audience here? Sports fans, gaming?
That's okay. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. It's interesting because of course, I would hope that soccer fans would pick up this game and play it really easily. When I play tested, I had a lot of friends who were not huge soccer fans. Maybe they watched other sports, or maybe they weren't sports fans at all. And but they really like this as just kind of a fun card game because the design is pretty simple, right? You play a card. If you're using the advanced rules, you can use the special ability, and then when you're done, you draw back up to your hand limit. And so, and I've actually had a few people, and this is probably one of the better compliments to say, "Hey, I learned about the World Cup through playing this game, and got excited about," because we play tested the 2022 World Cup, even though the Kickstarter backers didn't get it till after the tournament was over. We play tested it a year ahead of time, right? Around the time that we knew what the teams were going to be, there were still a few slots open, but around the time we knew where the teams were going to be, we had been play testing that. And a lot of people were really excited about how that tournament was going to play out when it actually came up.
Would any of your expansions include kind of all the really, smaller leagues? I mean, not small leagues, Serie A, things like that. I mean, Bundesliga.
At the moment, I'm hard pressed to do much with club-based tournaments. I had people ask about Premier League for a few reasons. I mean, one is because the World Cup and of course tournaments like the Euro tournament lend themselves to this really tight format where you're playing the whole tournament in one evening. Obviously, this could work on a league type of basis if you were to have a group of players that came over, and of course they do that with APBA and with Status Pro and other games, where they'll have players come and they'll do that over a series of time and play a whole season. The other issue is just simply about licensing. It's very easy for me to use the World Cup name, to use obviously the names of the countries. I just have basically flags and silhouettes of all the countries. So I don't use the licensing of, let's say, the national teams logos or anything like that. And that's just going to be a little bit hard pressed with more of a league type of format. Although I've had a lot of people that have asked me about Premier League, Serie A, Bundesliga, because those would be great places for this format to take place as well.
Speaking in terms of licensing, then we might not see, say, individual player cards, star cards you could play as a kind of a significant boost to a national team.
Yeah, I mean, in the game, I do have, for example, Maradona, greatest of all time, as an ability. And so by kind of putting his name in there, I'm not thinking that I'm going to be stepping on anybody's toes. I'm not trying to use images or likenesses. There is a small exception. There's the coach Hervé Renard, who I have a few images of his from some free image websites. But other than that, I'm not trying to step on too many toes as far as licenses go and things like that.
If you would, maybe just walk us through quickly, because I mentioned the playthrough video, and again, that shows you should have 4 players, and you have team versus team, the team cards, and then folks are throwing in, this is a goal card, and this is the countermeasure, and they're just kind of going around and playing a card for not just one game, but 4 games kind of simultaneously. So what is kind of your setup time here? And you've got the rounds cards here. Talks about the different match dates and schedules, things like that. So how do people get up to speed and just about how long does it take to play?
In our play testing, it's, a whole tournament. Now we've been playing more of like the 32 team tournaments. That might take around 2 to 3 hours to do that in a sitting. It helps to have someone, I would play that role, but I've had a few other people that have played the role of being kind of the tournament director. They can still play in the game, but they kind of more direct laying out the cards for the schedule. So I, of course, for every tournament, I have all the schedule cards that have the actual games that were played in that tournament. The way that Shaun Derrick did it in the old World Cup game is he would have literally all of the group games of all the groups be on one big board where you could play it at all at one time. I broke it down into match days. So it follows a little bit more of the progress of the regular World Cup tournament. Everyone has their first game, and then everyone has their second game, and then everyone has their third game. And as you're getting to the third game, as someone's kind of keeping track of the statistics, then you kind of start to know, hey, this team has to win by 2 goals in order to advance to the next round, or this team only needs to have a tie, or things like that. So it's certainly, I've tried, you've asked a really great question. I've tried to make it as easy as possible if you're not hugely familiar with the structure of the World Cup, but it certainly does help to have a familiarity of how that works. And my understanding from having played Status Pro and other people playing APBA, that a lot of those people are going to be familiar with at least the general structure of how a World Cup is run.
It's certainly becoming more familiar as time goes on here.
Yep.
What was your favorite World Cup? Favorite World Cup all time?
Oh, well, I attended a number of the matches in the 1994 World Cup when it was here in the United States. I'm thrilled for it to be back in North America again in now it's going to be about 3 years or so. Mm-hmm. I think that it was really phenomenal to see the crowds that the U.S. brought to all the games, for at least what was deemed at the time a non-soccer loving country. So that was really great. The U.S. did well enough to make it into the round of 16, and then didn't get further past that, unfortunately, to Brazil. But man, this last World Cup, I think people were surprised at how well it went off in Qatar. That final, watching that Argentina-France final, I still think is probably the best soccer game I've ever watched, just for the drama and for the storyline. It really played to a lot of the storylines that were happening. But I've also really enjoyed some of these women's tournaments, especially in the later stages. It helps that the U.S. does well in those tournaments, but it's been really amazing to see the level of women's soccer and how it's really, you've gotten a lot more parity among. Now they're going to have their first 32-team World Cup that's going to be in just a few months. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes in Australia and New Zealand.
Could you talk about the eras of play, Pele era, pre-Pele, Europe in the 30s, things like that, up till the present?
Mm-hmm. The storyline of the World Cup is that it kind of came out of a professional tournament. Before the World Cup, really, the Olympics was kind of the height of international soccer. But of course, as players became professional, of course, back then they weren't allowed to play in the Olympics. And so FIFA, which is an old French organization, came up with the World Cup in the 30s. And then of course, you kind of skip a lot of the 40s with World War II there. Of course, it really was growing as a European sport into the 60s and 70s, which I grew up on Pele as well. He really brought the game to life, and I think really helped become a global ambassador of the game. And we've really seen now, starting in probably the 90s, we've seen a lot of the analytics movement. But I also think with a lot of the resurgence of domestic leagues around the world, we've seen the ability for players from smaller countries to get noticed and to play at higher levels. And we've seen in the U.S. that as we've had more U.S. players playing in Europe, that's really helped the game in the United States. But that's been true with countries around the world. I think Morocco, a lot of people were rooting for them, not just simply if they were Moroccan or even African, but just because they represented something that wasn't European and wasn't South American. Not to kind of be, anti those parts of the world, but I think it's great to see a game where you feel like you can throw 11 players on the pitch, and if they're the best players, they could do some real damage no matter what country they represent. And so that's been really the fun part of this tournament, and really the fun part of making games like this. So
again, kind of to the idea of expansion and mechanics, with this aggregation of mechanics and card-driven action, could you see it working for another sport, say, since you're talking about an up and down the field kind of thing, basketball, hockey, things like that?
Hockey would be the natural go-to in the sense that the scores are relatively low, right? So your scores are lower compared to a game like basketball or football. I've thought about this as far as, and of course, when I say football, whoever's watching this, right, we're talking about American football here. American football might lend itself well in the sense that um, scores are generated through drives, right? So you have a drive that ends in a touchdown, or a drive that ends in a field goal, or a drive that ends in a turnover. And so that might lend itself to the limited number of turns that you would have. The tricky thing about going back to soccer that we're talking about here is that it's much more of a fluid, continuously flowing game. And yet in a soccer match, you have a limited number of really exciting events, a shot on goal, something that you think is a goal that's offsides. Maybe you have a penalty, maybe you have something like that. And that's why I think, and again, this was Shaun's original design, but this is why I think it works so well in this format. But hockey would be a go-to, football perhaps. The tricky part about football, though, of course, is that it doesn't have the shorter style tournaments that soccer has. Hockey, I know, does on an international level, though it's not really as popular. I'm a big fan of the World Baseball Classic. I think that's been a great thing in the growth of baseball worldwide, but I haven't really thought too much about how this game would play in a baseball context.
In terms of the actions, again, you've got this sizable deck here of all the actions. Were there any soccer actions? And you're talking about adding more, or with the where's it, the laws of the yellow and red cards and laws of the game here, but that's a fairly substantial. The assist, the defense, attack, penalty. Are there any facets of the game you thought, we can't really render this well, or is pretty much everything that you could see on the pitch able to be represented in a deck card?
Almost so. I mean, with the laws of the game expansion, that was something that was kind of a brainchild of mine to try to bring in those other elements: yellow cards, red cards, VAR. We have some injury cards in there. So injury cards really curtail. Yeah, yes. And of course, my brother did phenomenal artwork on all of those. So the way those work is that the event cards in the regular game all have black and white striped, what I call referee icons. Those That's kind of more of the American football referee image, because in soccer, referees usually wear solid colors that's just offset from the two teams. But it was an easy icon to put on there that would be catching to the eye. When you play a defense card, if it has that referee icon, and if you're playing with the referee deck, then you have to turn over one of those cards and reveal what's on that card. Now, the tricky thing is that referee card often will work for you, but it may work against you. And that was an interesting aspect, where you can try something in a soccer match, but if the referee catches you, you might, all of a sudden you might have a yellow card played on you instead of on your opponent. Or all of a sudden you might have an injury of something that you did. You saved a goal, but you had an injury in the process, and that may hurt you later in the match day. So that was a really, I don't know if I would say everything is related in the game, but a lot of things are. We have substitutions in the main game. We have, of course, stoppage time. If games end in a tie and you're in a knockout round, we have extra time. We have a really great penalty kick mechanic, which has been really fun to work with, which we can talk about.
I was just going to mention that, because in the penalty kick, if I remember correctly, I see here, you've got, this isn't quite the right card, but if you look in the cards here, you've got different color balls. You have, say, a blue ball in that corner, and then you'll have the green card, the color, and very few, there's yellows and then the gray, there are only 6 of those. So when you're doing the PK, I guess two players put the card down, and if you have to kind of match the color of the ball in that corner, and of course, I don't know if I have the card here, but there are like 32 red balls, 16 yellow, something like down to the 6 gray. So you've got randomization or kind of probability in there, right?
In the original game that Shaun made, he just had a custom die, and you rolled the die, and if it came up white, then the kick scored. And if it came up black, which I think was only one face on a 6-sided die, then it would get blocked. Now, that's fine to bring in the mystery element, but it's just very random, right? With those colored soccer balls in the corner, I call those game balls on every card. They don't have an aspect. They don't have an aspect in regular play, but in stoppage time, those also figure out which teams get those extra half goals in stoppage time. And the way the game works for your fans that don't have it yet, at the end of the match day, if you have 2.5 goals, then that just counts as 2 goals for your team, right? Because that's realistic. But if you get that extra half goal in there, then all of a sudden what would be 2 goals would jump up to 3, because that 2.5 would then jump up to 3 there. With this card versus card mechanic, all of a sudden there's a little bit of psychology involved, right? And that's true in real soccer, right? Most goalkeepers aren't good enough to stop a penalty kick by reaction. So what they have to do is they have to guess which direction to dive and then dive in that direction. If they're lucky, they can stop the kick. If they're not, then they don't. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And it's been fun to kind of watch people, and when they realize that the colors aren't represented equally in the deck, it really makes them think about what the other player may have in their hand. If I have a gray ball, which you mentioned are very rare, and I might use that to score, because the likelihood is my opponent's not even going to have a gray card and a gray ball in their hand that they can block me with. But I've seen times where the other opponent has had one, and you have 2 gray balls, and all of a sudden the penalty kick is stopped, and everyone's shocked by watching that. So it's been a really fun mechanic when you kind of learn how it works there.
That really does seem awesome for sure. And you mentioned it, all the fans may not have the game yet. How do they get the game now? We're post Kickstarter, right? Is there any?
Yeah, we're post Kickstarter. So there's a couple of different ways you can get to my website, worldcupcardgame.com. Also, my company is infinitepigames.com. So infinite pi, P-I. So infinitepigames.com. Yep, you got the cards there. And you can order the game there and all of the expansions. I'll throw out a coupon code there, APBA. How about I put that? I'll put that on there. I'll give people $20 off the package if they want to buy the package there. I'll give them $20 off if they put in the code APBA. I'll set that up right after our Zoom here. And that way your fans can pick it up there. We're working on distributions. I have a few game stores that have it in there that are listed on my website. Most of those are in California right now, where I'm located, but looking at some other distribution options. But hopefully people will watch the playthrough video, will watch this interview. And if you're fans of the World Cup, I think you'll just dive into this game really, really easily, and maybe even show it off to your friends who aren't as interested in tournament-based soccer.
Will you be doing any personal demos at any events this year?
I'm going to be at GameX, which is this weekend in Los Angeles. I usually try to run a demo there, so I'll be there at GameX if you're in the Los Angeles area or at the LA Hilton there. I'll also plan to be there over Labor Day for what is it? Gateway is their version of Strategicon. I'm going to be going to Gen Con for the first time as just kind of an observer there. I don't have a table there, but I may bring the game there and try to run some demos there just to kind of show it off to people, as well as my other game, Sovereign Chess. If you're a chess fan, that's always a fun variant as well. So,
could you nutshell Sovereign Chess? I meant to ask you about that. Was that your first game?
Yes, it is. Sovereign Chess is a 16 by 16 board. It's a 2-player game, but with pieces of 12 different colors. The players start with a regular complement of white and black pieces, just like regular chess. Your object is to checkmate your opponent. However, there are 10 other neutral colors around the sides of the board. In the center of the board, there are colored squares. And if you land on, for example, the red square, then you can control the red pieces. If you move off the red square, then you don't control the red pieces anymore. If you're on the red square and you move a red piece onto a yellow square, now you control red and yellow. But those neutral pieces can change hands. So all of a sudden you've developed pieces, and if your opponent's able to take control of them, they can use them to checkmate you. And the fun thing about the game is it looks bigger and more complicated, and it might be, than traditional chess, but it plays a lot faster. I've had games that have gone by much more quickly because every color has their own queen. So if you're able to control 4 queens, most chess players can checkmate their opponent that much more quickly.
Awesome. Mr. Mark Bates, some very intriguing game concepts here. Thank you, sir, so much for your time and your insights. Thank you for that very generous discount code, World Cup, folks. It's a fantastic game. It You talk about quality components. This is an heirloom quality game, and it really does play great. So thank you, sir, for
Hey,
all your
thank you,
work
Jeff.
on this.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. Good luck to you and your members.